Act 1. The inversion. For most of computing history, software waited. You clicked, it responded. You queried, it retrieved. You commanded, it executed. The relationship was clear. Human intent preceded machine action. Somewhere in the last 18 months, that sequence reversed. It didn't happen in a press release. There was no launch event. Instead, millions of people began noticing something odd. Their tools had started finishing their sentences, preempting their searches, suggesting edits before they asked. The shift was small enough to seem like a feature upgrade, but the underlying architecture had changed. AI systems stopped being retrieval mechanisms and became interpolation engines. They no longer waited to discover what you wanted, they predicted it, then acted on the prediction. The question, "What do you need?" became, "Here's what you probably need." Permission transformed from explicit to implied. This is not about autocomplete. Autocomplete finishes your word. What emerged was different. Systems that finish your intent. Act 2. The economic substrate. When a technology stops asking for permission, it alters the cost structure of decision-making. Consider the search engine. For 2 decades, search required you to formulate a question. That formulation was cognitive labor. It forced you to know what you didn't know, to translate need into syntax. Search engines competed on answer quality, but the question itself remained your responsibility. Generative AI inverts this. The model constructs the question for you, often before you fully articulated the need. It removes the formulation step entirely. This seems like a reduction in friction. In economic terms, it's something more. It's the outsourcing of problem definition. When problem definition moves from human to model, something subtle shifts in the market. Value no longer accrues to those who ask the best questions. It accrues to those who control the interpolation layer. The person who can name the problem has historically held leverage. When AI names the problem, that leverage migrates. We saw this before in a different form. Google didn't just answer questions, it shaped which questions seemed worth asking. SEO became a multi-billion-dollar industry because ranking was epistemology. Generative models are the next iteration. They don't rank answers, they generate the question-answer pair simultaneously. This changes who gets paid and for what. If you're not mediating the formulation, you're competing with a system that mediates it for free, at scale, with no marginal cost. Act 3. The behavioral ratchet. Humans adapt to convenience faster than they adapt to its consequences. When AI stopped asking for permission, user behavior compressed. People began skipping steps, not because they were lazy, but because the steps became invisible. The model anticipated, the interface streamlined, the micro-decisions disappeared. Psychology research has a term for this: action cascades. When the gap between intention and execution shrinks, people execute more, think less. The cognitive load drops, so does the feedback correction loop. This is why interfaces that just work are neurologically different from interfaces that wait. They collapse the deliberation phase. And deliberation is where second-guessing lives, where skepticism emerges, where you notice something is off. Early email required you to click send. Modern AI-drafted emails can be sent with a single tap, sometimes automatically, if you've enabled the feature. The difference seems trivial, but that extra click was a checkpoint, a moment where you reread, reconsidered, caught a mistake. Remove it, and the error rate doesn't drop to 0. It just becomes harder to detect. When tools stop asking for permission, users stop granting it consciously. The default becomes yes, and defaults shape behavior far more than we admit. Act 4. The delegation trap. There's a specific cognitive shift that happens when you delegate a task so many times that you forget how to do it yourself. Calculators didn't make people worse at arithmetic. They made arithmetic optional. Most people can still add. They just don't, because why would they? Generative AI is doing this with a different category of task: synthesis, summarizing an article, drafting a response, structuring an argument, formatting a thought. These tasks are not arithmetic. They're not closed-form problems with correct answers. They're open-ended, context-sensitive, and iterative. Doing them manually is how people clarify what they actually think. Writing is thinking. Summarizing is sense-making. When AI does this for you, it's not removing drudgery. It's removing the loop where your half-formed ideas become coherent ones. And most people don't notice this is happening because the output looks fine. Often, it's better than what they would have written themselves. This creates a ratchet effect. The more you delegate synthesis, the rustier you get at it. The rustier you get, the more you rely on the tool. The tool improves, your skills atrophy, and eventually the gap becomes structural. You can still do it, technically, but the opportunity cost makes it irrational. Historians call this deskilling. Economists call it comparative advantage shift. In practice, it means a generation that can prompt but not produce, that can evaluate but not generate. The question is not whether this is good or bad. The question is, what happens to a society where synthesis is no longer a widespread skill? Act 5. The permission creep. Here's the part most people haven't noticed yet. When AI stopped asking for permission at the interface level, autocomplete, suggestions, generations, it set a precedent. If the model can anticipate what you want in a document, why not in a purchase, in a schedule, in a decision? This is already happening quietly. Algorithmic systems now pre-approve credit, pre-select content, pre-filter job candidates, pre-route deliveries. These are not generative AI, but they follow the same logic. Predict intent, act on prediction, optimize outcome. The difference is that generative AI makes this feel collaborative. The system isn't deciding for you, it's helping you decide. Except the help is so seamless that the boundary blurs. We're entering a world where the default mode is the system acts unless you explicitly stop it. That's the inverse of how consumer protection, informed consent, and civil rights were designed. Those frameworks assume you opt in. The new paradigm assumes you opt out, if you notice in time. This is not a conspiracy. It's an emergent property of convenience-driven design. Every feature that removes a click, every automation that removes a step, shifts the burden slightly. Over time, the aggregate effect is a reversal. Agency becomes something you assert, not something you possess by default. Legal scholars are starting to notice. The term gaining traction is algorithmic pre-emption, when systems act on predictions faster than humans can intervene. The law is structured around the idea that you cause harm after you act. But if the system acts before you've decided, who's responsible? Act 6. The cognitive reorg. There's a deeper pattern here, beyond behavior and economics. When tools stop asking for permission, they stop being tools in the traditional sense. A hammer waits, a car waits, even a computer historically waited. These are instruments. They extend your capability but remain inert until activated. AI that anticipates is not inert. It has a prior. It has a model of you, of the task, of the context. It doesn't wait for you to define the problem. It proposes a definition and asks if you agree. This is a different relationship. It's closer to delegation than instrumentation, and delegation changes how you think. Psychological research shows that when people work alongside an agent that has initiative, a colleague or an assistant, they start to think in terms of division of labor.
They stop tracking details they assume the other party is handling. They develop cognitive dependencies. This is fine when the other party is competent and aligned. It's catastrophic when they're not. The challenge is that AI models are competent at pattern matching, but not at intent alignment. They predict what you're likely to want, not what you actually want. And in most cases, those are the same. But in the cases where they differ, edge cases, novel situations, ethical dilemmas, the model has no mechanism to recognize the gap. So you end up with a tool that's right 95% of the time, wrong in ways you don't expect, and that has trained you not to double-check because it's usually right. This is not a technical problem, it's a feedback loop. The better the tool gets at being right, the less you verify. The less you verify, the more consequential the errors become when they occur.
Act 7. The Quiet Rewrite. There's something happening in language itself. When AI generates text at scale, emails, reports, articles, messages, it introduces a statistical bias. Models are trained on human text, but they produce output that's more average than human text. They smooth over idiosyncrasies, regularize phrasing, converge toward the center of the distribution. This is why AI-generated content often feels slightly generic. It's competent, clear, but lacking a certain texture. The edges are filed off. Now imagine this text becomes training data for the next model, and that model's output becomes training data for the one after. Over time, the distribution narrows. Language becomes more uniform, more predictable, more compressed. Linguists call this entropic collapse. It's what happens when a feedback loop amplifies the average and suppresses the outliers. The implications are not aesthetic, they're epistemic. Language diversity is how cultures encode different ways of thinking. Idioms, metaphors, neologisms, these are not decoration, they're cognitive tools. When language regularizes, so does thought. We've seen this before, in different forms. Monoculture in agriculture reduces resilience. Monoculture in ideas does the same. If AI-generated text becomes the dominant form of written communication, we're not just automating writing, we're narrowing the space of expressible thought. This is not happening in 5 years. It's happening now. Academic papers, corporate emails, news summaries, more of these are model-generated than most readers realize, and the trend is accelerating. The question is not whether this is efficient. The question is, what gets lost in the compression?